underlying structure to the group that even though it seems unstructured. So that, you know, we could do something with that. But
I'll start writing the concourse now.
Bad Q joke. I too was a doc student learning Q, and now I'm a professor continuing learning Q methodology. It's a well, it just feels really nice to be here, and I appreciate very much this opportunity to talk about Q methodology in general, and maybe today, you know, applying it to classroom research. I thought I might talk about some of my experiences with that, and one case in particular I can highlight. And I learned Q under the mentoring of Stephen Brown as well, taking the research seminar, I think around 2012, and just jumping into a project because the class, as you all know, you know, he's very encouraging of projects. And so we worked on one looking at dynamics of doc students and faculty members in the Council Ed program. So we just sort of jumped right in, had no idea what we were doing, and kind of learned along the way, and still doing that. So just thank you so much. And as Mustafa said, I'm at the University of Alabama in the Counselor Education program here. And as part of my experiences, like learning the culture, that's still a learning experience, but getting to know faculty, we experienced we are experiencing some change in the program and that sort of thing. And it's impacted instruction. You know, COVID has impacted instruction, but even before the pandemic, trying to balance teaching duties and doing teaching well in an R1 institution takes a lot of work. It's really easy to kind of retreat into a silo of, let's get the teaching done, and I got to get back to my research, especially the pressures that junior faculty face. So because I'm too dumb to quit, I maintain a scholarship of teaching framework in an R1 institution. And, you know, these Q studies that I've done recently, 2 of them have been in the spirit of demonstrating to myself, but also to folks who evaluate me, that you can actually do pretty rigorous and meaningful and applied research with small samples related to teaching. And you know, it turns out I don't need a big grant to fund it. So, woo! Anyway, so I'm actually looking here at some of my notes. So if I drift, I apologize. I'm having a squirrel moment here. So I'll just talk about in general, you know, the idea of what classroom research is. Like anything in the scholarly world or the research world, there's a bunch of definitions of it. And so when I think about classroom research, I think about a process. And it's a process of using research methods, in our case, Q methodology, to help me, the instructor, develop, implement, and evaluate what I'm doing in the classroom. And it's really not as me focused as you would think. It's about the learning of students, and trying to use the method to, you know, deal with my biases of being an instructor and deal with managing accreditation requirements, which for counselor education, you have to stuff a lot of standards into the curriculum. It's almost like, you know, it drives some of what you do. So you have to interpret a lot of that. But classroom research is also purposeful, and, you know, it's really intended to help improve instruction, but also stimulate you intellectually. So it's not just about getting through the semester and getting grades inputted and things like that. And leave, speaking for myself, leave me with some sort of product or deliverable that I could share with the community. And that's in the spirit of teaching and learning, I think, scholarship of teaching and learning. So classroom research, that's kind of what it means for me. There's some principles that underlie classroom research then, I think, that are important. You know, if you're able to formulate or propositions and investigate them, and this is why I turn to Q methodology, you know, that's going to inform quality research and then in turn inform improved instruction. So it's fun to investigate propositions and have a way to do that instead of just maybe talking with a fellow faculty member about that and so forth. So, and then, you know, the self-improvement process, which reflective teaching for me is part of scholarly teaching and part of the ethos of what I'm standing for, I think, amidst a very research-heavy culture, I want feedback that goes above and beyond student opinions of my instruction or peer observations, which can be harsh, but can also sort of be biased. You don't really want to put negative peer observations of your teaching in your tenure dossier when you're going up. So you're not looking for people to pick you apart. Hopefully that makes sense. So if you're capable, as a capable teacher, you can be a capable classroom researcher. As a capable researcher, you can be a capable teacher. I think these things inform one another. And so that's sort of the foundation of a way that I merged my interest in scholarly teaching with what I learned about Q methodology. I'm still learning. Any questions or comments about what I've said so far? Soliloquies, anecdotes, short phrases in song. Okay, nothing so far? Okay. It's weird because in my Zoom space, I'm looking, thanks, Erica. Hey, Erica. I see my giant face and then little faces on top. It's, wow. Zoom life. Anyway, okay, so why use Q for classroom research now that we've established the foundation of, what is classroom research, at least to me? I think opinions matter. I think student opinions matter. I think my colleagues' opinions matter. I think my observation of teaching matters, but I think operant factors matter more. And if you can find the underlying structure of what's going on in the classroom situation, if you consider the classroom, instructor, and students as the population of that particular classroom, well, then you have all the makings of a really great Q project. And so a lot of times if you teach a class and things go well or they don't go well, it's really hard to recall everything that happened. And it might be even harder to look at those student evaluations again, especially if you have negative comments in there, because even though there are 20 good ones, you're going to look at the one that is critical, right? This is what we do. And it's okay. I was only teasing about the view. Sorry. So, I think, my curiosity before I mentioned this specific case, my curiosity is that, as academics, as faculty members, we have a lot of passion for what we do, and we're learned and we read and we're informed, but we also have egos, and vulnerabilities in what we do. And so if things don't go well in our teaching, that can be heavy, and there's a lot of ways we can react and cope with that. It can be, well, I just have to be good enough at this, but however you respond to it, I think, it's important to get some sort of feedback, and be able to navigate, how that all goes. Sometimes in the case that I'm going to mention, instructors' opinions about things or their views really don't align with students and cause problems. And so, it's one thing to go into observe a classroom and say, there's just such a mismatch between what your expectations are and what the students' expectations are and views. And it's another thing to do a study about it. And that's really to externalize that stress and strain that happens when instructors when things aren't going well in the classroom. You can externalize that by sharing data. And I think Q factors can be great sources of information to give an instructor feedback about their teaching, and to, in a way, use those things as a bridge, maybe specifically items where there are consensus in a study, to use it as a bridge to say, well, this is how the instructor sees things, and this is how you see things, and here's what we have in common. Let's have a conversation. It could be used as a midway checkpoint. In the particular case of the field experience course that I studied, there was a really big mismatch between what the instructor thought how things should go and how new folks in supervision should perform, and what the students thought. And so that's kind of what happened. I got sort of pulled into it by curiosity as a researcher, but also as a way to support a colleague who's a wonderful human who is struggling, trying to make their way through their probationary period in R1. And so that's what we did. We talked about, well, what can we do to try to use the research process, which can happen actually in real time, because we collected the data almost at midpoint. We're able to talk about it just a couple of weeks later before we got to the end of the semester. That's another thing great about Q studies, right? But how can we have a conversation in an informed way that isn't too threatening to the instructor and isn't too threatening to the students? Make sense? Q can be great for this. So I investigated a counseling practicum course. I looked at the course as a case study, very small N size for this particular course. And I had learned some lessons from doing a classroom study before, because I decided to get creative with some of the ways of doing data analysis, and it didn't really work out. So I got some good feedback from colleagues. I made some adjustments. And it turns out just because you think it's a good idea or you want to be creative isn't necessarily the right way to go about doing it. But I tend to make those sorts of mistakes and then let them get fixed with good feedback and learn from the situation. It's sort of a jazz music approach to research in some ways. But anyways, so I worked with this faculty member to take a look at this practicum course to see how can we get folks on the same page. And the way that we went about doing this, because there was a lot of tension about how students were supposed to show up to the course and prepared to participate in the supervision process. A counseling practicum course is really a group of students who are all out in the field somewhere working with clients, and they've got supervisors at their respective sites, but they come back together in the classroom to talk with the university instructor, the university supervisor, about their experiences. And when they come into the class, there's the literature talks about processes, but there's also, each person has an ideal perspective on what the student should be doing, how they should be prepared, how they should talk, etc. So we looked at the literature that informed the instructor's view and supervision, and accessed the Common Course from the supervision literature, best practices documents, recent literature, pulled down these items, and we narrowed it down based on what we found in there related to supervisee roles. Students in a practicum course are referred to as supervisees. So if you hear that term, okay. So what does the literature, what do experts say that supervisees should be doing to show up prepared, to participate, to be the quintessential supervisee who's gonna kick butt and take names, and do a great job. And so we had this, we put the sample together. We were able to do this in, we pulled down probably 10 articles that were heavily cited, 2 best practice documents, and went through the thing. We were able to pull a sample together, and we narrowed it down based on roles and responsibilities. And then I think the other the items in the Fisher design had to do with preparation, communication, some items like that. So we actually used a structured design to narrow down the items. We ended up with 48 statements. Let's see here. I'm looking at my notes, pardon the pause. So we got this together. Now, this sort of dovetails into some of the other, maybe a broader conversation, but we were talking a little bit about, Mustafa and I were talking a little bit about, the publication process and things like that. But just being able to show a trail of how, we got the Q sample together is important to editors and journal reviewers, even if it's really about what they do with the statements, the participants, and how representative it is of a phenomenon in the Common Course. But nevertheless, reviewers like to see a methodical, at least in my profession, a methodical step-by-step process, and that needs to be outlined in methods, So the other thing about the research process at my institution is you're not allowed to research a classroom. So one reason why we partnered, you could never get it through IRB at the University of Alabama. I partnered with him and we sort of troubleshot the issue together. And I was the research coming into his classroom. So I've had to do that. It is, Erica, it is a challenge. And so if I wanted to conduct my own research, I could only use it for local dissemination, local like curriculum, informing curriculum and teaching practices. I ethically could not publish that. So that's a particular challenge working in this R1 anyways. So I worked with him on that to study his class. And let's see, we piloted the items, the three of us. I did the sort, he did the sort. We had a doctoral co-teacher who also did the Q sort, and just worked through the content of the items together, make sure everything was okay. You know, so I'm just going to kind of shift. I'm just going to talk about some of the logistics of like the design and the data collection, if that's okay. But let me pause. Am I making sense? Because sometimes when I talk a lot, I feel like I'm moving in a lot of directions. Is this coming across in a fairly sensible way?
You're doing great. Sounds good.
Oh, sounds good. That's all right. Okay. So far, so good. Okay. Moment of insecurity had to be checked. Okay. So I then came into the classroom, the instructor left, and we used pre and post classroom time to collect the key sort of information. They had the class. They were willing to stay after the class, and I in the room with the participants, we talked through the post-interview questions. You know, why they endorsed certain items, they ranked them high, they ranked them low. What was the process like? You know, what were the ho-hum items? You know, why was that not a big deal or on a 0 or and that sort of thing. And then ask them some questions about just open-ended questions about what's your experience been like so far trying to navigate the class. And so that became some additional qualitative information that we could attach to the factors when we did interpretation. It went pretty well because they were very vocal, let's put it that way. And it also protected the instructor. But the dissemination of the factors in conversation actually happened between the instructor and the students. That was the pragmatic part of it. Like, so I coached him up on what the factors mean and some consensus items. And he talked with the class about that. And interestingly, among the 3 factors, the instructor and the co-instructor loaded under a factor we called dutiful learner. That was the ethical focused, ethically mindful, follows the graduate program policies. And there was, you know, there was one other student that loaded on that factor. All the others loaded on 2 different factors. And so right away, intuitively, based on the dynamics, you knew that it was sort of a him versus them kind of phenomenon. And turns out that was true. And so, you know, I was able to show him that first in the factors. And so he could see that it wasn't just, you know, like he was feeling ganged up on, but they actually saw things differently based on the items that we selected as a way to kind of level the playing field and say, look, this is different viewpoints, but they're playing themselves out here. And I think it's a good way to bridge the conversation. And so we had a couple of good sessions talking about that, how to bring that up and how to talk about the factors with the class and what it means. And ultimately what it boiled down to practically was that he expected a lot of preparation work to be done, a lot of reading done ahead of time, you know, and that's a fair request, but the amount of internalizing and understanding and being able to extract from that was a little premature for folks who were new to field experience. It's like they could have done that at the end of the class, but it was kind of being expected at the beginning of the class and wasn't fair. And so in addition to that, that dutiful factor where he aligned, the one student that aligned with him was actually a non-traditional student, much older, had come back after many, many years in the field. And they were the person in the class that was super excited about everything that was going on and all the learning, and like they were right there raising their hand, and like, you know, it was really all that was happening a lot of times. So it was like, of course, that, you know, it was sort of intuitive that that was going to happen. So anyways, that's kind of how what happened. We ended up with 3 factors, and I'll talk a little bit about the some of the analysis and the technical things. There were a couple of really tricky things that were related to the IRB and related to the data needing to be de-identified. I ended up selecting some different methods for analysis and this came up in Steve Brown's class like a month or 2 ago when I presented in there. And Steve asked me, how did you feel about the fact that you used PCA? And for me, I said, it doesn't feel very good because, you have a small sample. So the reliability of the factors can be called into question because you don't have as many participants. But I knew their views were so strong that something was going to be there structurally. It's just that in order for me to manage the data, I couldn't know who was attached to what, if that makes any sense. And so, but I was allowed to make connections after the fact, but not during the process because they were the IRB folks were very clear and very firm that you couldn't do anything in there that could influence the dynamics in the class. And there were already many complaints, frankly, from the students. So if I had to do it again, I probably would have done a different analysis and, a different approached it a little bit differently, but I rolled with it. And it turned out the data was okay. So let's see. So basically what happened was, I guess in terms of analysis is when you can't use the theoretical rotation, judgment because you can't identify who they are. But I knew who my anchor was. I knew who the instructor was. So that I was familiar with that code. And so I knew where he was situated, in the cluster of scores and things like that. But overall, I learned about it once I saw the qualitative responses from folks and started connecting it to the factors and the factor array and factor scores. Okay, so there were a total of 9 folks in there, and the loadings were particularly high. And so, and they were very, very distinct, which is strange for a small number, but you could argue that mathematically that was there, but because of the analysis approach, but at the same time, one combined with a understanding and observing the classroom context and that anecdotal data, it ended up working out okay. And the factors were strong. The factors themselves are generalizations, and that population of that classroom, those instructors and students, I think it's fair that those factors generalize to that particular group. And the study was conducted to solve a particular problem of basically a near mutiny in the class. I don't recommend that for approaching all kinds of studies, but I do think it's a very practical way to go about, using research methods to improve the instructional experience and learning. If people are upset and not heard and there's an impasse, there's no vulnerability that can take place and no emotional evocative experience and therefore no learning. It's like an iron curtain effect that happens and there's conformity dynamics instead of real learning and being able to navigate the types of things that need to happen in order to appreciate supervision, which in counseling is everything for your learning. Because when you graduate the program and you're out in the field, your supervision becomes the foundation for your continued learning. So if students in a practicum class for the first time have a bad experience with supervision, it sets the precedent for going into the next supervision experience with negative views. And similar to counseling, when someone has a bad counseling experience, they go into the subsequent counseling experiences, maybe with a different professional with negative views. You don't want to set that precedent with learners either. So that's kind of what the spirit of the project was. Okay, let me think here if there's anything else. So I think, as I mentioned before, let's see if I can pull this up here. There were some items, and Steve Brown mentioned, a good way to bridge that, conversation. He acknowledged that when I was talking in the seminar, to talk about areas where people agree, and to coach up an instructor when you have like factors and you have distinguishing statements. It's really easy to prepare a table to say, here is where there were some points of agreement. Maybe start there and then work your way outward to where there's most disagreement. You can talk about ways to bridge that. There's certain things instructors cannot do. They can't just throw all of the parameters out the window, but at least you can use it as a basis to explain why, and why something needs to be the way that it is. And I don't think that was happening. So this was a way to not only spark a conversation, but use the data to actually move it forward in a way that would hopefully break down all those tensions. Yeah. Some examples of differences between factors. So there was a factor we called dutiful. It was all about adherence to ethical codes, guidelines. It was all about professional boundaries in sessions, which is important. But most importantly, that factor where the instructors loaded was all about following procedures and policies of the graduate program. So they would get a manual and it's like, you got to do this and this and be on time and this, that, or the other. On the other end of the spectrum, we had the expressive learners. And in that group were former police officers who had been, folks in the military who'd come back, some very experienced people, but new to counseling. And they were really more about like thoughtful questions and let's talk about counseling. And then let's talk about, what this means working backwards from the big questions that they would have. And for them, supervision needed to be a safe space for them to ask those sometimes challenging questions. And that's an adult learner with those life experiences. That's what you get in your class. You don't get a matriculated student with their hands folded saying, yes, sir, no, sir, but strangely, some folks may fall back on that way of thinking and their biases, and it's a no-go. And then on the other hand, we had a discerning learner, which was really more about this particular learner. And there were three folks who led on this factor, the second factor, discerning learners, who were all about like, look, this is all great. Big ideas are great and rules are great, but I want supervision time to tell me how to use the counseling skills to help the clients. That's what supervision is. And that's what we should be talking about and that sort of thing. And so there were strong opinions about that. Well, if it's too much about procedure and all the stuff that you're supposed to do outside of the classroom, and you don't make enough room in the classroom to talk about using work samples and talking about what you actually need to do with clients, you're going to have some dissatisfied students. Turns out there were some folks who felt that was important. And so that helped bridge that conversation too, so that work samples and conversations about connecting, supervision with actual work could transpire without, meltdowns and power struggles. Anyway, that's what I have. The bottom line was the outcome of that was that whole study and that whole project was that we were able to have good conversations and actually intervene and actually head off some student complaints, improve the quality of the classroom, and it wasn't perfect. I mean, but it was better, and he was able to manage it on his own without people coming to advisors and things like that, and learn from the situation. And then writing it up was a challenge too afterwards. So, working with him to do the write-up and with that particular framework being a case study in classroom research with a small sample and the analysis, it becomes very difficult to pack all that into a manuscript and deal with reviewer 2 at all and all the pushback and things like that too. So that's what I have.
Thank you, Dr. Baltrinic. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Miku, do you want to take over? This is how we deal with
Oh, sure. I was just going to say thank you so much. And if you have questions, comments, you can just start typing them into the chat as you think of them, and then want to leave the space open to just unmute yourself and jump in with any comments, reflections for Dr. Baltrinic.
Technology used to manage or process data.